I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Joanna Christodoulou. Did you say that? Who is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at the MGH. And it does not stand for Massachusetts General Hospital, right?
Right.
Institute of Health Professions in Boston, Massachusetts. Joanna received her doctorate from Harvard Graduate School of Education through her training as a developmental psychologist, clinician, and cognitive neuroscientist. Dr. Christodoulou examines the brain behavior dynamics underlying reading development and difficulties. Her current research projects study the existence and impact of summer slide in readers and examine intervention outcomes and compensatory approaches for struggling readers. Dr. Christodoulou's funding sources include the Fulbright, Spencer, and Birch Foundation. She holds affiliations with the Harvard Graduate School of Education and Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The title of her presentation is different than what it is there, and then I'll just read that. Brain differences and interventions for struggling readers. Yes, please help me welcome Joanna.
Hi, hello everyone. Howdy is how it goes. I'm trying to learn the lingo. This is my first trip to Texas, and it's been amazing so far. I'm very, very honored to be here, and I'm very excited to just have a conversation with you as I walk through my presentation. Just to give you some context, my work is at the intersection of the clinical world. So I see patients and students who are struggling in school and nobody's quite sure what's going on. And so the clinical world, the education world, and the research world. And I lead a team. I named my group the BEAM team. So it stands for Brain, Education, and Mind. So we're Beamers, and we have some fun with our acronyms. So we're located in Boston. I also teach at the Harvard Grad School of Education, where I was a grad student, and I do my neuroimaging work at MIT. So Boston is a great city just to have lots of different parts of the community all working for understanding the reader and the reading brain and behavior dynamics. So I use behavioral assessments and an MRI machine to understand what, a little bit more. And I study factors that contribute to doing something better and looking at who an individual is and how we can harness that variability to improve outcomes. So the context, we have a good understanding that reading disabilities, they're the most commonly identified learning challenge in all of the school-age population. That means for people who don't elect to come here, so in college or graduate school, you choose this. But for a child whose obligatory job is 9 to 3 p.m. for 18 years or so, minus the beginning, the majority of kids who are identified as having issues have those issues because of learning challenges in reading. And the focus of an educator or a clinician is to do something about those challenges and figure out how to improve them. But it turns out that despite all of the effort that's been put into this for all the years that we've been doing this, there's a long way to go to improve the answer to the following question. For whom should we do what? It's a simple question, but it is one that is not well answered and leaves a lot of room to grow. So we know that effective interventions can help struggling readers because so much of their effort is trying to figure out what those squiggly signals on a page mean and how that translates to sound. And when you can't access the text, you cannot understand what it's trying to convey. So with this research context, the problem space that I work in is the following. We understand that early intervention has a really strong impact. We know these cardinal rules that the earlier you intervene, the better the outcomes are. So one question that I'm trying to parse out a little bit is to differentiate remediation and compensation. So if we think about that for a moment, if we have a struggling reader, we have a choice. And often this choice is not well articulated. And that choice is, do you focus on the deficits? Do you try and figure out what's wrong and work exactly on that skill set? Or do you try and get around it? So when you're trying to focus on the deficit, what you're doing is working on remediation strategies. When you try and move around the deficit and get to the outcome that you want in an alternative way, you are working on compensatory strategies. So we often don't articulate the difference and what are we trying to do and for whom should we do what? When should we try and figure out when to fix deficits? And when should we try and figure out when to get around those deficits? And is it a developmental story? Or is it a story about the individual? Or is it an intersection of those two? So I'll talk a little bit about some insights that we're working toward. We also know that individuals differ in terms of who responds to intervention. So here's a question for you. If you happen to be in a school setting or would like to be, let's say that school asks for your advice. Which intervention program should we buy? We have program A, which improves on average, well, let's say, on average both of them work equally. But one of them works by improving 90% of the kids by 5 points, and the other program works by improving 10% of the kids 50 points. That's an extreme example, but I invite you to entertain how do you make those choices and how can understanding who our students are help us make informed choices for what we should do with them. So selecting programs and predicting individual response to intervention is a huge challenge with a lot of work to be done. So that's the problem space that I'm thinking about all of this work in. So I'll talk about two of the studies that we're working on. One is looking at measuring intervention efficacy, and the second is identifying compensatory approaches. And the latter one, I want to point out that I'm showing half the brain because it'll be a study about people who only have one of their hemispheres, and they're helping us understand how you can read with half the brain. So the first study is looking at the question of how do reading skills compare across typically developing readers and struggling readers at the beginning of the summer. Straightforward question, and some interesting things that we'll talk about. And the second question is, what is the impact of intervention for young struggling readers during the summer on reading? So let me just set this up a little bit more. If in Texas, maybe you can share this with me, what are common things that students will do over the summer? Is there something at the state level or the district level or the school level that students engage with in terms of summer literacy, or is it completely variable? Very variable. Okay, so there's no fixed program or recommendations each school or family chooses for themselves. So this is interesting because this gives us a lot of variability to think about. Should there be recommendations, and what should they be, and should they differ for different kinds of readers? When we think about the summer, there are a couple of terms people use all the time. So they'll say summer slump, summer slide, summer regression, and there is an assumption among people that in the summer there is something that happens to skills and they slow down or they fall back in their development. As it turns out, I'm going to share with you some of the background research, but I'll just preview for you now to tell you the following. When we look at the empirical research that's been done on the summer slide, let's call it, it turns out that the majority of that work has focused explicitly on one specific perspective. And that perspective is socioeconomic status. That means that they looked at families, and kids in families, and they asked parents, what is your education, and what is your current job? And using those two pieces of information, education and job of mother and father, they calculated the socioeconomic status of those families, of the child's context. And they asked the question, does that matter? In terms of reading ability, does SES matter, have any implications? And it turns out that it has huge implications. So if you are from a relatively low socioeconomic status background, let me work it backwards. If you're from a high SES background, imagine the kind of summer activities you may engage in. Those might be things like summer enrichment programs or camps or a lot of literacy activities with your parents. And so the trajectory of readers from high SES backgrounds in the summer continues in an upward slope, just as it was during the academic year. The academic year, people are learning. In the summer, if you're from high SES, you maintain that upward growth. okay? And it's directly related to the kinds of experiences you have access to because of what SES literally can buy you, right? Okay, now if you think about kids from mid-SES backgrounds, these are students who, as it happens, they hold their ground. That means they don't fall back, but they also are not in the same upward trajectory as their peers. In low SES kids, you can now imagine what happens now. These are kids from environments that do not have a lot of resources and opportunities. And so during the summer, their trajectory is not up, it's not neutral, it's down. That means that the gains that they had made by the end of the academic year fall away. So by the time the academic year starts again, they are significantly below where they were at the end of the school year. So many of us have heard about the achievement gap and differences by student groups and school settings. Think about this. In a school year, the experience of kids and students is essentially equalized. Everyone is in school for the same number of days, with the same curriculum, and so forth. Once you go to the summer months, the experience differentiates immediately. And when you think of it from this SES angle, people attribute the huge differences that they refer to as the achievement gap as being driven by the summer. So I'll say that one more time because that is a very powerful idea. The achievement gap, or the huge growing differences between students from different socioeconomic status and backgrounds, about 80% of the difference between students, student performance based on SES, is driven by differences that happen during the summer. So this question of SES makes it very clear that the summer is an incredibly important time, and how you spend your time in those couple of weeks or months has huge implications for your long-term educational trajectory. So now the question is, if we have a good understanding of the summer slump from the SES angle, that means that we can understand that SES is a huge risk factor. So low SES is one risk factor that can contribute to summer slump. If we think about our struggling readers, or readers who would have trouble during the academic year, the question we want to ask is having a reading difficulty another risk factor? And so what does a summer slump look like among this population of students who really struggle with reading? So that's what we'll talk about now. Now, to kind of bring a couple of the themes I've been mentioning together, one goal that we have is to try and do a better job of predicting who will benefit from what intervention. So again, this question of for whom should we do what is the big question we want to address. And so one study that we ran, this is very exciting. So this study was called the START study, Summertime Adventures in Reading and Teaching. Okay, and so what we did was we did brain scans using an MRI machine before and after, and we also did standardized behavioral assessments before and after, and we asked this big picture question, can we predict which children will benefit from which intervention? To answer that question, we started out with one program, and the goal is to do it and repeat it over and over with different kinds of programs to understand who might benefit from what the most, okay? And so one program, and we want to look at the brain behavior links for individuals. So, with that context, let's just remind ourselves of what we know from the summer slump. So let's go back to that for a moment. In addition to what I told you about the SES story, we also know that there have been informal measurements of the summer slump. So here's what they've done. They have done measurements from the fall to the spring, that's our academic year, right? And they compared that to spring. So in this study, when they wanted to see what happens during the summer, they didn't have any measurements from the end of the school year to the beginning of the next one. The best they had was to compare the academic year to the full calendar year. Okay, and in that way, they found that there were higher gains from fall to spring than when you include the summer. So that was in direct evidence of the summer slump in the general population. But that means not that they're falling behind in terms of a downward trajectory or losing ground. It means that the growth of student learning in the summer is slows down for the general student population. Okay, so that just sets us up for being of interest to for any student that we work with. And there was a study that had been done. Actually, this was an unpublished master's thesis. So for any of you who are doing graduate work and they don't read your work, I'm here to tell you they will. And so this work, they evaluate students who were in the general education classroom. So of course, in that setting, there are many reasons why students can end up in special education. So it could be for any reason they end up in that context. But what they found was that those kids lose ground compared to their typically developing peers over the summer. So again, here I'm just reminding us of what I had shared about the socioeconomic status story and the achievement gap story. Okay, and so we're up to this question now of what about our struggling readers? We actually don't have any published studies that look at the summer slump from the angle of our struggling readers. Okay, so in our study, we had about 77 students. They had all just finished or were going to finish first or second grade. So they were at the very beginning of their education. And we recruited them from the community, and we had both typically developing readers and we had struggling readers. So in order to come out of this study, being able to evaluate the efficacy of the intervention, we used a randomized control trial. That means of our whole pool of students who are struggling readers, we randomly assigned kids to either get the intervention or to not get it. And just to share with you, I never would want to tell a parent during the summer, do not read with your child. Don't do anything. You're in the control group. We did not do that. So what we did do was say, okay, you have been randomly assigned to the intervention, so please join us. And for those families who were not randomly assigned to the intervention, we said, you can do whatever you would have done otherwise. We will just ask you to share with us what kinds of activities you did. And when the 6-week study is over, you can receive the same intervention for free at any point in the next year. So in that way, we tried our best to balance ethical and research needs in that way. So our students were matched for age, matched for gender, and matched for nonverbal IQ. And they were all in the average range. I should say our typical readers were a little bit higher. Where we are based, a lot of the families who are from typically the parents of the children who are typically developing, who elect to come to do neuroimaging studies, tend to be our professor colleagues and their kids, or people who are from environments that are very interested in doing science for fun on the weekend, and have that time and resources. So that's definitely reflected in our groups here. And then of course our typically developing readers are stronger in measures of logical awareness and rapid moving. And very importantly, our groups are all matched on SES. So that is not a factor that we have to entertain for this. So the first question we're looking at is, at pre-test, just at the very beginning of the summer, how do people look? How are they doing? So you can see the dashed lines are the average range. Everything between the dashed lines is the average range. So our typically developing readers are in blue. They're doing great across the board. They're hovering right at the high average range. And then the green bars are students who are struggling, who are randomly assigned to receive intervention. And the red bars are struggling readers who are not in the intervention group. Okay? So here we are just taking stock that at the beginning of the intervention, our struggling readers are roughly equivalent. There are no group differences. And they're all hovering at the low average range for single word reading in either timed or untimed context, real word or pseudo word reading. So no surprises there. And the story is similar for passage comprehension. So now our intervention group, we had them come, this was done at MIT, so we had graduate student offices that we revamped into first and second grade classrooms. And just as an aside, you should see the faces of scientists peeking out of their labs when they heard this gaggle of first and second graders walking down the hallway with very confused looks on their face. So what we did next, we had these kids come for 4 hours a day, 5 days a week for 6 weeks of their summer. 100 hours to 120 hours of instruction, the whole time was reading instruction the whole time. It was always done in groups of 3 to 5 children max. And this study was done in collaboration with Linda Moodbell, who some of you may be familiar with. We partnered with them. They provided all of the teaching infrastructure. We provided all of the research infrastructure, okay? So these kids came to this incredibly intensive instruction. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the kinds of programs they offer, the company offered to teach the program called Seeing Stars. So it actually is interesting because their most commonly used program is actually a different one called LIPS. That focuses more on speech motor control and so forth. But this program that they recommended that we use is something that really tries to develop symbol imagery. That means if you were to close your eyes and I said a word, the goal of the program would be for you to imagine the letters and the patterns and the imagery, even the semantic content that comes along with that. Does that make sense? Okay. And so they start off having students visualize letters, and it increases in units from there, from syllables, words, and then to connect to text. So when you get up to the sentence level, you're imagining what the story is telling you. And so this whole visualization and use of imagery is one approach that they have to teaching struggling readers how to read more effectively. And the idea is that chronological training is embedded in that sort of thing. So it's not without chronological training, it's embedded with it. Okay, well, what you see here is just what I showed you before, but instead of having typical readers included, now we're only looking at our struggling readers and what happened. So I'll highlight that this first test here is specific to the company. And so we thought if we don't see gains on the measure that was developed by the company that's most similar to the intervention, or I should say, if we do see some intervention effects on this test, we'll feel like it worked, that it did something. Because if you don't see it here where it should be near transfer, that would be worrisome. Does that make sense? Okay, and the other measures are all standardized measures of single word reading and so forth from WRT or the tower. Okay, so remember that the green bars are our students who are in the intervention and the red bars are not. So this is what happens at pre. And now notice that this is now post. So our dark green bars are what happens after all the intervention. On the measure that we would expect to see gains, our intervention group definitely showed improvement that's significant. However, when we look at standardized tests of reading, there is no difference from pre to post, despite 100 hours of instruction, when we look at untimed word reading or pseudo-word reading. So just to say that one more time, 100 hours of instruction made no difference for standard scores for our struggling readers. This story was very worrisome to me until I saw what happened to the kids who were not in the intervention group. So the red bars I just added that are a little bit darker. Our students who are not in the intervention group, on every single measure that we had, they significantly declined in standard scores. So that means for our intervention kids, their holding their ground was actually a positive thing in comparison to our non-intervention kids who significantly lost ground on all of the measures that we administered. So this story is similar with a couple of other tools as well. And if we just to show this data in a different way, these are gains or losses. These are different scores. So you can see the green is our intervention group, and they basically improved where we expected on the company's program assessment, and basically held their ground otherwise. This is a little bit of an outlier, so we can talk later. And then our red bars are non-intervention group, and they are just slumping. Okay. So you might think, well, what did that other group do? Did they just do nothing all summer that's related to literacy? Was there a range of activities that they engaged in? And it turns out that we asked all of our students, what else have you been doing with your summer? And of those who were in the intervention group, only one student received anything additional. And of our students who are not in the intervention group, there was a wide variety of what they did. It ranged from 0 to 80 hours of instruction. But even when we include this information in our models, it doesn't account for what happened. That means that even with this huge wide range of, on average, about 14 hours of instruction or 14 hours of literacy activities, it didn't make any difference in what their outcomes were for their summer experience in literacy. We also check to see if our findings can potentially be explained by attention or ADHD diagnosis, executive functions, nonverbal cognitive abilities, expressive language, processing speed, externalizing or internalizing issues, or behavioral symptoms. And none of these explain what we saw either. So there are a couple things. For one, it's very unusual to have an intervention study that shows positive impact of the program by showing no change, right? So that's quite unusual. Usually we look for no change for the non-intervention group and positive change for the intervention group. So we just changed the definition of showing efficacy for intervention programs because it's a factor of when we administer the intervention. And so when we consider that this program actually was effective because we prevented the summer slide in these kids, it then converges with other studies that also examine this particular intervention program. So other studies at the STARS were done during the school year, and they showed gains for the treatment group at the board level, as we have as well. But something important came out of this, which is that this shows us direct evidence for widening differences between students with reading difficulties who do and don't receive intensive reading opportunities in summer. And this converges with the story that we had heard about from the SES angle. So now that we understand that SES has a lot of evidence as a risk factor, we now can think about reading difficulties being incredibly high on the list of risk factors for what happens to literacy skills in the summer. And it helps us, there's one of our kids in the program here, this helps us really inform our definition of what is a successful intervention. Is it sometimes that you're preventing loss? Is that enough? Is looking only for positive gains the only outcome? So this helps us reinterpret successful interventions as sometimes preventing slide as opposed to fostering positive growth. Okay, so this helps us think a little bit about what we can do to close gaps that have an opportunity to grow during the summer months. And it helps us think a little bit about this question of who should we do what? For our struggling readers, it's incredibly important to think very carefully about how they spend their time outside of school during the summer. And I'll just add that one of our families actually was randomly assigned to the intervention group, and they asked to be moved to the other group because they said that they were so exhausted and they just wanted a break from reading. Okay, so there's something very important. I mean, our kids who are in our intervention study, they knew already how they compared to their peers. They were not hidden from the reality of what their struggles meant and how it felt to be different. And so I think a lot of them, I'll just share a little bit, they loved coming to MIT, they loved coming to summer school. Now, who would say that? To focus on the very skill that was incredibly powerful for them. But I think what happened is that they were among other kids like them. They were no longer the outliers who couldn't do what was expected of them. They were all addressing the same thing, getting support on the area that was challenging for them, and among their peers. So it was no longer about being different, it was about being people who could understand and so forth. Okay, so quick pause. So I'm going to move on to different study. How are we doing so far? Keep going. Okay, so the next thought to think of is, the next thought contained is the following. If you are managing a classroom, or if you have a client, or a child that somebody asks your advice on, and they say, what should I do with this person? How can I ensure that they will be a better reader by the end of whatever you recommend? Imagine how likely it is that your prediction or your assignment to whatever treatment that you recommend, imagine how good you are at predicting. Do you know a particular child will improve based on a particular recommendation? And if you can't know 100%, how do you feel confident in your recommendations? Right? Because this is our job, right? We get trained in the best possible way, the best possible tools at the time, to try and say, for this particular child, here's what you should do. That tool or that package or that instructional delivery model and so forth should really support them. But we're not that good at the individual level of predicting for whom should we do that. Okay? So that's a big problem. In medicine, there has been a movement towards personalized medicine, right? So if somebody has cancer, it's no longer if they have this kind of cancer or that kind of cancer. They now can look at the mechanisms driving the cancer, not where it's located, to now think of medications that are better suited to that. So now instead of addressing the diagnosis, in medicine, there's a movement towards addressing the etiology. And that could be incredibly powerful. So in the reading world, are there some ways we can do a better job of prediction in terms of who will respond to what? So right now, one of the most exciting parts of the neuroscience world is this question of neuroprognosis. And people are exploring this question to see if brain science can help inform this question of who should we do what. Now, if we look to the literature to ask the question, how many people have reading difficulties? Even the question of identification is one that there is not agreement on. So for any of you who have to, well, let's see. So you will be familiar with the bell curve. Yeah. So now, imagine the bell curve, and I ask you, where is the line where abilities on one side and disabilities on the other side? And is that line fixed? And who decides where that line is drawn? This line is a moving target, and it ends up being driven by resources. So I have a colleague who works in California as a speech-language pathologist, and asked her, where is the line on your bell curve? How do you know where the ability-disability differentiation is? She says, 3 standard deviations below the mean. Okay, so if the bell curve is less familiar to you, that means that a very small fraction of students will qualify. Very small fraction. If you put standard deviation at 1, who remembers how many students would qualify by definition? So I think it's about 16. Yeah, so one standard deviation. So now think that's 1, and then there's 2, and then 3. Okay. So I asked her, how is that possible? That's just such a stringent criteria. And she said, because we don't have resources to accommodate any more kids. There are just too many kids already when you draw the line at that extreme to manage. And so we are up against reality and limited resources in the school context, and that is something that we definitely need to be aware of. But even when so just at baseline, when you come to the question of who's a struggling reader and how you identify them and who qualifies, our estimates are both inflated and deflated. So there's not a lot of precision in just even knowing who should we be addressing here. And there have been some studies showing that the chances of struggling readers in 1st grade, the chance that they would improve enough to become typical readers later in elementary school is at chance. That means a lot of work to be done, right? At chance. So if you're a struggling reader in 1st grade, the likelihood of you being a better reader later at the end of elementary school is 50-50, right? So this leaves a lot of room for things to be done. And finally, this whole question of, well, interventions, how effective are they? The literature shows that there's an incredibly wide range, anywhere from 2 to 6% to 30 to 60%. But notice the number is never 100. It is not the case that there's an intervention out there that has shown that every single child has improved. That would be something that we would refer to as a magic bullet, right? Which we know doesn't exist. And so there's just a lot of difficulty in this whole question of the prediction intervention stage. So there's an economist whose name is James Heckman, and this slide is from his work. And the reason I really like it is because it shows us how important it is. This drives home, from an economist's perspective, the importance of the earlier the better. And here's how. This shows the rate of return to investment. So the earlier you invest in people, how much you get back from it as a society. And here is just age, so preschool, school, and post-school. And the amount you get back investing in preschool programs is very high. And the amount you get back when you invest in adults is very low. So this idea that the earlier the better really gets exemplified by thinking about how it plays out at this level. Now, this whole question of prediction and neuroprediction may feel like a little bit science fiction. But here are a couple of advances that have already happened in this direction. So for one thing, in the study, they wanted to know who's going to actually benefit from a weight loss program. So who's going to lose weight following this intervention? And it turns out that they were able to predict who would benefit from this weight loss program by scanning people's brains as they looked at food. Okay, so that was very effective in predicting weight loss by this reactivity to food images in the scanner. They also have done this with predicting cognitive functioning in older adults by looking at the structure of their brain. They've done this in the domain of treatments already. So not reading yet, but what they have done is predict treatment responses for both depression and anxiety better than was able to be done using the best clinical tools that physicians actually use. And the same thing following head trauma. Now, reading, I'm going to tell you this, and I'm going to show you the study and come back to it. So the headline for the reading story is the following. It has not been done for intervention, but what has been shown is that reading performance in teenagers over a 2.5-year period can be robustly predicted with neuroimaging, and it is at chance in terms of prediction for behavioral. So this study I'm going to focus on a lot more and unpack for you. But first, I'll show you my favorite slide. Now, we might want to shut the lights just for this one, but how many of you have seen brain blobs and looked at the reading brain before and so forth? Okay, now what I want to just highlight for you, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the reading brain. What I want to highlight for you is that the reading brain is incredibly dynamic, and it involves a lot of regions of the brain. And when we see those pictures in the media, they're usually showing us just one snapshot, really, of what happens when we're reading, because of the nature of how it is analyzed and collected. So I just want to share with you, what does it really look like when a typically reading adult reads one word? Okay, so I'll just play this for you. Want to see it again? And it is. Oops. Okay, isn't that amazing? That is reading. Okay, now we can put the lights back on. Thank you. So that is what a reading brain looks like. It's incredible. It involves so much of the brain. But when we actually talk about the reading brain, we have this simplified heuristic. Okay, so always remember that video, but now I'll tell you kind of how it's broken down into these, into the story that we tell and that we see in those brain pictures. So when we think of typically developing readers, we have 3 systems that we tend to think about. We have anterior, just means front, so we'll refer to our frontal anterior system, and posterior means back, right? And I'll tell you 2 more neuroscience terms, dorsal and ventral. So dorsal, I always think of the dorsal fin on a fish on the top, and ventral, I think of gills, a lot of you, if you're a fish, right? Breathing, vent, right? So dorsal upper, ventral lower, okay? So these 3 systems are really driving the reading brain story. And notice that they're all in the left hemisphere. So the frontal system, the anterior one, is really supported the processing of motor production, so my ability to actually use my mouth and speech motor system to produce sounds, and to process low-frequency exception words. An excellent example of this is last names. Last names carry cultural heritages that are the most distinct vocabulary in our experience, right? So you saw my last name, and that's very low frequency. Probably had never not seen that many more times. And we often encounter these words that we have to harness our frontal system to support our reading of. Our posterior dorsal, is that the upper or lower one? Upper, great. Okay, so posterior dorsal one is really when we do, we translate information from one symbol system into another. So that means our written system, those are symbols. They're just squigglies on a page that we all culturally agree that they represent something consistent. And our speech, the same thing. We're producing sounds, but we culturally agree that those sounds have meaning. So we're mapping our speech symbolic system and our written symbolic system. And this dorsal system really helps us pivot between those two systems and translate. And our ventral system, that's what you would recruit if you're recognizing your last name. That's really where that's supporting automatic recognition of printed words. So they also call this the visual word form area. So it's immediate, quick, automatic recognition of words, okay? So you can imagine developmentally, we have this shift from actually when you're at the beginning of kindergarten. I showed you that we start off, we have a left hemisphere lateralized reading brain system. It doesn't start that way. It actually starts bilaterally on both sides, and by the end of kindergarten, you left lateralize. Okay, and there's another shift, which is you shift from dorsal to ventral. And that's not that you don't use your dorsal system anymore, but it's just that you really build up this inventory of words you recognize. So the more experienced a reader you are, the more you recruit your ventral system over your dorsal system. Okay. Okay, so now we have this understanding of what reading difficulties are, so I'll keep going from there to share that the signature of the dyslexic reading brain has a couple of components. One of them is that this frontal system is hyper activated. So there's more activation in the frontal system for those with reading difficulties compared to their peers. And there is hypoactivation, or less activation, in both posterior systems. That reflects what we see behaviorally. So our struggling readers have both more struggle decoding, sound symbol mapping, and recognizing words, sight word recognition. And they also do not ever disengage their right hemisphere. So I mentioned to you before, developmentally, we start off bilateral and we left lateralize. Those with dyslexia never left lateralize. They continue to recruit the right hemisphere region as part of their system. So one thing I want to highlight for you is that when we think about the frontal system, we understand that in typically developing readers, it's left lateralized, but our struggling readers recruit in that little red circle the right hemisphere homologue, or the same, so our typically developing readers have that anterior system on the left. Our struggling readers have it on the right as well. Right hemisphere never disengages. But it's interesting because people refer to that frontal system in struggling readers as compensatory. What does that mean? It's there, but the functioning of it is really not well understood. So what I want to share with you are some potential preliminary pilot data trying to think about this. So we use an MRI machine. We have one of our participants in scanner. So just as a reminder, an MRI machine doesn't have any radiation. It just uses radio waves and magnetic fields to capture a picture of the brain. So we use this very commonly with kids in the aging groups. Now, remember I mentioned to you before that neural prediction slide, I said that there's been a study done in the reading world. Okay, so I'm going to tell you that study in detail and then follow up with what we did. Okay, so in this other study that was done by Filippo Hefting and John Gibrelli and colleagues, they had kids with dyslexia and they had kids without typically development. And they wanted to know, can you predict reading over time? And if you can, what tools help you do that? So they, on average, the first time that they saw the kids when they did brain scans and assessments was age 14. And they just came back 2.5 years later and did just assessments. And they looked at the change scores. So that means time 2 minus time 1, right? And In the scanner at time 1, they did a task in the scanner where they had kids look at 2 words and decide, do those 2 words rhyme? And then another task where so they'd either see words that did or didn't rhyme, and they had that contrasted to words that were or weren't the same. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what they did. Now here's the amazing thing. This is one of the coolest neuroscience studies that's been done in the reading world in the past 10 years, for sure. They found, as I mentioned before, that the ability of any assessment to predict outcomes was at chance, which is sad, which is powerful to understand. The ability of the functional imaging, so how was someone's brain working when they did that task I just showed you at time 1, and what part of the brain predicted outcomes. They found that it was a region in the anterior system in the right hemisphere. So remember, if you imagine, okay, what part of the dyslexic brain might help us, if you were to change the dyslexic brain to make the reader better, or when readers improve for dyslexia, what about their brain changes? I'll tell you that intervention studies have shown that on average, struggling readers, when they go through effective intervention, their brains end up looking more like typical readers. That means that instead of having hypoactivation in the posterior system, they ramp activation up in those regions. This is very unusual because it's a story about the right hemisphere. And not only that, it's a story about the right frontal part of the brain, which all people have referred to before was to say it's compensatory. This study among these teenage students is showing that this activation in the right frontal region is reflecting, the more people activated that region when they were 14, the better reader they were when they were 16 and a half. So let's think about this in the context of what our findings are next. Okay, so far so good? Any questions? Okay, so we did a similar task in the scanner. We had kids push the button when they saw the same word twice. Okay, we contrasted that with false spots and do the same thing. So this one is language-based, that is not non-verbal-based. And here's what happened. Now, this is a study that I had shown you before, our START study. This is with kids who are 6 to 9 years old. And when we looked at the exact same region that I had just shown you, we found the opposite, which was the more they recruited this region of the brain, the less they benefited from the intervention. Okay, so at first pass, this may feel surprising, and it certainly is, and it's definitely pilot data, so we're examining this further. But here's a possible way to interpret it that could be incredibly interesting. For one thing, the implications and the way that we interpret this is to think about this. When you were a teenager, when you were 14, 16 years old, by then you have been a struggling reader for about 9 or 10 years. The predictors of success may not be fixing what's troublesome, but figuring out how to work with what you have. So if we are referring to this right frontal region as compensatory, it may be the case that those teenagers are learning how to use what system they do have and optimize it. And the more the struggling readers can optimize the system that they have in place, the better they were in the long run. In contrast, for our study with these young readers who are just beginning their education careers, it might be the case that the more they recruit this compensatory region, the less they're benefiting for the following reason. Effective and early treatment may relieve their reliance on compensatory mechanisms. So this is something that really converges with what we know about the behavioral side of things. But it just may be a developmental story where the earlier you intervene, the less likely it is people may need to rely on compensation. Why? Because you're remediating. So this remediation compensation story is on the radar to really think about further and add this developmental angle to it. Okay, so I'm aware of time, so I can either share 3 more slides or just pause and stop. What would you like? Okay, because the next one is an incredibly unique story, so I'll just get to the headline of it, which is another, so I'm transitioning now, but I'm still exploring this question of compensation. I told you that the reading brain story is a story about the left hemisphere. And we understand that those with dyslexia recruit the right as a compensatory mechanism. Now, what if we were able to work with people who only have a right hemisphere? So this is the case for a small portion of the population. And the extreme circumstances that would lead to having only one hemisphere are that they have had seizures that are so extreme, hundreds a day, that they have tried every other medical intervention possible. But the last one that remains to them is to have their whole left hemisphere removed. And you might think, how can you still be, what kind of person, how do you function as a person with one hemisphere? And these kids are amazing. If you were to meet them, the one thing you would notice is that they, on the opposite, so the motor system is bilateral. If you take out the left, you'll see the motor system on the right have some implications, so their gross motor may be impacted. But they are purely kids. So I had to do some assessments with these kids, and they definitely loved their candy, they definitely loved playing around. They were such a treat. They're kids, they're amazing kids. But they tell us this very powerful, they give us this very unique, powerful opportunity to understand how can you read with what people might refer to as the wrong hemisphere, the one that people rely on only when the left one is not optimized. So we studied these kids to understand what the maximum potential is of this hemisphere that so far has only had a compensatory role. And so what we ended up finding was that I'll just share today the behavioral story that in our imaging with them as well. But it turns out that kids who have had a hemispherectomy and who only have the right hemisphere are performing better than those with dyslexia on some of our measures that involve timing. Okay, and so the one headline from studying this group of individuals, and you can see they're in the green bars, so there are ways in which they have certainly been impacted, but the ability of their ability to recover skills that they had and then make progress in those skills, and especially in their literacy skills, is amazing. And it makes possible the potential for the right hemisphere to actually be a reading brain in isolation. There are a lot of implications about how they do it and how it's unique to the potential of the right hemisphere. But what I wanted to highlight is that reading is possible with this right hemisphere independently. And it comes with some very interesting advantages over dyslexia, which is a bit shocking, right? And we're studying how they do it, how the characteristics of the right hemisphere make reading a different kind of task for them. So this is just one more slide I'll share with you. Some of our brain scans. You see where it's very bright white? That's where there's no brain. So when you take the hemisphere out, the other brain half stays there, and the rest of the brain fills with cerebrospinal fluid. And so you're going to see some of the brain scans as we did with different participants for our reading activities. So, so why don't I just take stock of what we've covered today, and just think about this whole contribution of neuroscience, and what it has done for us and can do is help us understand our groups. What we cannot do is use imaging at the individual level. So for example, if you show me a brain scan of a student, we cannot say if they have dyslexia or not. Everything we know about neuroimaging is about averages. But what we have here potential to understand is contributing to this question of who can benefit from what, and also understanding more about this compensation and remediation question by understanding populations like those who have had hemispherectomy and those with dyslexia. So I think I'll leave that slide up for another minute and just show you this one very quickly. Just want to thank all the people who contributed to this work. And I also want to share a quote I really appreciate. There's a book called Far from the Tree by Andrew Solomon that I would recommend. And so he highlights for us that this idea that variation is the only invariable is what I find very, very helpful. So maybe I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Any questions? Sure, there are questions.
Yes.
On the first study, I was kind of curious as to why, was it the Lindenby Bell personnel who chose to do single stars
Yes.
versus lips?
Yes.
Can you tell me why they made that choice?
Sure. I think, so for those less familiar, LIPS is a program that teaches people, for example, if you put your hand on your throat and you make the B sound and then the sound, you can feel the difference, right? And so it's really training how things feel and so forth. Seeing Star doesn't do any of that. It's all about visualizing things in mind. And so one way that they were exploring this was when you overtrain logical skills, the advantage you get is that people get very good at decoding. That means that the strategy they rely on a lot is to see a word and break it down every single time. Break it down, right? The disadvantage to using that strategy to the exclusion of any others is that you never get to be a fluent reader. Or reading fluency is the challenge that you're up against because you're always slowed down by breaking words down. So I think in this study, they offered to use Seeing Stars because it would give us an opportunity to study the strategies that included both phonology and also visualization without the risk of potentially not having kids be fluent as well. So this is, that's as much as I know about that, yeah. So this also comes down to what skills are you trying to improve? And if there's a child for whom they really cannot parse the sounds of language and produce them or perceive them, then a program like LIPS may be optimal. Or in the case of kids for whom that is okay, then the consistency or authenticity is a challenge. Seeing Stars may be another alternative. Yes.
The START study that you said mostly the population was people that, colleagues.
Well, the typical readers were. Our struggling readers were mid-SES kids. Yeah.
So do you have plans to attempt to replicate that with lower?
We actually did the study that same summer we partnered with a school that has kids from low SES communities, so I just didn't include that data because of time limitations. But we do have that, and that's pretty interesting because the SES story is very consistent with this literature. So the question we're asking is there an exacerbating impact having reading difficulty if you're low SES? Yes.
I'm just wondering regarding your first study, the over 100 hours instruction.
Yes.
Is it? I just guess the frequency of the instruction and the period of the instruction was also affected to your intervention findings. So.
Because it was so much?
I think it's not much.
I think it's not much.
Yeah, because if you instruct 5 hours every day,
yes.
so over 100 hours is about 4 weeks or 1.5 months. So to see the intervention effects, we need to see over 6 months or 1 year.
Oh, this is an excellent question.
No, so do you think that
yeah.
Over 100 hours instruction is effective or
okay, so this is great. So once we can identify the program, then how do we know how much of it you need to meet what dosage and over what time scale and how intensive or spread out should the thing be? Here's an important challenge. If you ask the developers of reintervention programs, they should have these answers because they have the data, right? And so in this context, we partnered with Lindenby Bell and requested their advice on what's the minimum dose and frequency and duration that would yield the impacts expected of this program given all that you know. And what they thought would be important was the hours and the intensity. Even if you do this program during the school year, their model is still one of intensive. It's still one that requires a certain number of hours and so forth. So, so this question is a very interesting one because there's no fixed rule. But 100 hours is a lot. It is a lot, especially in the context of no other academic instruction. So if you had to do 4 hours a day during the school year, it's not, you can't. I mean, there's no time left over. You're in school and there are other demands on your time. So this balance of where in the school year or the school calendar we are and how intensivity of dosage should be titrated accordingly is open. But the expectation was, the minimum was 100, the maximum was 120 hours. So that was by design, to make sure that we got the minimum by, as recommended by the interventions. Yes.
I also have a question related to the first study. So you mentioned about how much dosage, but do you think that your study also depends on what type of dosage you give to the kids? Like you just use the same study intervention
Right.
program, or for example you use another program as also a comparison. I think probably the result will be different. Like if you find the students in the struggle with their own hold the ground in the treatment group.
Right.
But if you recruit another kind of intervention program,
Yeah.
probably you can see improvement.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we would hope, right?
Yeah.
So here's what we don't know. This is the first one. So the first study in this paper just got accepted to the Journal of Learning Disabilities, so it'll be available. But the goal is every summer do this and examine it from different perspectives, different intervention programs, and really examine this question of, is it specific to this particular program that you're holding your ground, or is it any? Because the difference between our intervention and non-intervention is so dramatic that you think that, okay, any intervention group has to counter all of that slump and then still push us over, right? And so the ground that's lost is very significant. So an intervention program that would both prevent all of that slide and keep them on a trajectory that's upward would be incredibly impressive and helpful. And so now to find out what that is and for whom might it be different, for whom would it be what, is definitely the goal of our future research. Yeah, definitely. So it is 1 o'clock.
No, 1 o'clock in
In
Boston.
Boston. It's 12 o'clock in Texas, right?
Yeah, just a
Right.
couple of comments,
Sure.
and I think then we'll stop and go to
Sure.
the next session. Number one, Linda Woodbell program was taught by Linda Woodbell staff.
Right.
So there might be a Hawthorne effect, so they might have given more importance, or they might want to show that their program works.
I would hope so. But they didn't do any of the assessment.
Yeah.
We did that. So we hope they give it their very best. We really want, that's our wish, that they do anything that they have as part of their programmatic implementation to optimize everything possible.
Yeah, but then, when this has to be transferred next time,
Yeah.
there may not be in Linda Woodbell staff
Well,
in the schools.
Yeah, okay, so that's interesting, because maybe the story is, at best, kids hold their ground,
Okay.
right? That's what that would translate to. If the implications are that this is the most optimal administration of the protocol, it may be that less optimal means that all instrument readers slump, but it's just a matter of degrees.
Also, supposing you present this to the principals or the administrators, I think it gives kind of an easy way out. Then I can always say, they come from such low SES, I really cannot teach them.
Uh-huh. So maybe when we publish our low SES intervention outcomes, we can, well, there are many groups that show that different kinds of interventions for low SES are incredibly effective.
Yeah.
There's one research group that actually, their intervention is about $2 per child, or less than $10. And what their intervention is giving kids a few books over the summer, and that's it. And this is done by Jimmy Kim at Harvard Ed School. So it doesn't have to be expensive, but it does have to be something. And there's no condition under which a child cannot become a better reader.
Okay,
Or not,
good.
yes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good presentation. And, you can take a 2-minute break, and if you have other things to do, then you can do that. If you want to stay and just talk informally, that's also fine. And there's some water there, and you can try to get some food.